Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Good Lawyers Gone Bad podcast. My name is Stuart Teicher. First of all, I want to apologize to you. It's December, and as you can tell from looking at the calendar, this program wasn't released on the normal date that I try to release things. And here's what I can guarantee you. This will happen every December. December is my most busy month, my busiest month for speaking. I can't even use English properly, and I'm a speaker. I teach continuing legal education for a living, and the end of the year is the end of the compliance period for a lot of jurisdictions. So December is my crazy month, and I can guarantee you that every single December, I will have a problem getting my podcast out on time. But you want to know something? It's worth it. Because the lawyers in today's story, well, it's an incredible story. The lawyers weren't convicted of any crime, but you simply have to hear what they did. I considered it worthy of this podcast because of how the Florida Supreme Court described the behavior of the attorneys involved. The Chief Justice of the Florida Supreme Court called the actions by the lawyers in this case, quote, among the most shocking, unethical, and unprofessional as has ever been brought before this court. So it might not be true lawyer crime, but it's definitely true lawyer slime, and it's a heck of a good story. Raymond Fernandez was a sergeant in the city of Tampa, Florida Police Department. Fernandez was on the job for 18 years, and he spent the last 15 years on the traffic enforcement unit. Over those years, he marched up the ranks of the department until he achieved his current position as the commander of the traffic enforcement unit. That unit had another less formal name. It was known as the DUI squad. There are multiple parts to a successful DUI prosecution. An officer has to properly administer the breath test. There needs to be special paperwork filed, and all of that must be done in accordance with very strict procedures so that it can hold up in court. What could arguably be considered the most important part of the stop, however, well, that happens out in the field before any of the technical stuff occurs. Specifically, there needs to be probable cause for the stop. A cop can't pull over a driver and just test them for alcohol. There needs to be some justification for stopping the vehicle in the first place. Now, an anonymous tip, that's not going to do it. I learned that as a young lawyer because that was the issue in one of the first cases I watched being tried in municipal court. I remember vividly sitting in the gallery in a municipal court in New Jersey watching this trial unfold. The defendant in this particular DUI trial, he had multiple priors. He was going to lose his license for about 10 years if he was convicted. What happened was, a couple was driving down the highway, trying to keep their distance from another car. And that's because this other vehicle was all over the road, and they just knew that whoever was driving that thing was hammered. So, being good citizens, they called the police to report it. The police dispatcher asked them where they were, what was the make of the vehicle, where they were heading, and pretty much nothing else. The tipsters described the car to the police dispatcher, provided the license plate number, and hung up. Now, they surely felt good about themselves having done their civic duty, and they went on their way. The dispatcher didn't ask them for their names, and the couple just rode off into the distance. The dispatcher sent a cop out to the area where the car was reported to be heading. The black and white raced out to the scene, and luckily, a car with matching plates was exactly where they expected it to be. So, being a diligent officer, the cop immediately pulled the car over. Turns out the driver was way over the legal limit, and he was arrested for DUI. The day of the trial came, and it looked like a slam dunk for the state. The prosecutor began the case by putting their sole witness on the stand, the arresting officer. The officer testified that there was an anonymous tipster who called the dispatcher. The dispatcher then sent the officer to the area where they expected the car to be. He got there, he saw the car, and he immediately pulled them over. The prosecutor then had the officer testify about all the details of the breathalyzer machine, the readings that were received, and all of the other technical stuff that's necessary. When it came time for the cross-examination, the defense attorney rose to his feet. I'll never forget what he looked like. He was 6'3" with a very bushy head of stark white hair. He looked like a 6'3" Q-tip. He was a large, animated man. He had an air of confidence in his questioning as well. And he started his cross-examination by asking the officer. He said, "Officer, tell me again about what happened when you arrived at the scene." The officer seemed a little confused. It seemed like a silly question. He said, I found the vehicle and I pulled it over." The lawyer asked, "Why did you pull the car over?" "Well, there was a couple who told the dispatcher—" No, I don't want to hear that," the defense lawyer interrupted. "Don't tell me what the dispatcher said or this mystery couple. They're not in court to testify about what they said, so that is what we call hearsay. You just tell the court what you saw." The officer stammered. I think he could sense that the case was in trouble. And while the officer kind of waffled, that's when the defense lawyer pounced. "You didn't actually see the vehicle drive erratically, did you?" No, the officer admitted meekly. And that was it. There was no more questioning. The lawyer was finished with his cross-examination. The state rested their case, and as soon as they did that, the lawyer made a motion to dismiss, and it was granted. Why? Because there was no probable cause for the stop. The tipster wasn't present in court to testify about the defendant's erratic driving, and the cop didn't see him driving poorly. The cop simply matched the plate number to the plate number provided in the tip and pulled the car over without seeing whether there was any erratic driving. There was no probable cause to justify the cop making the stop. Now, if the tipster had been in court testifying about what they saw, well, then there would be probable cause. Or if the officer had waited a little while, watched the vehicle drive erratically, then there would be probable cause as well. But neither of those things happened. There was no one in court that day who could testify that they saw the car driving erratically, and the defendant walked. As a police officer whose job was dedicated to DUIs for almost 2 decades, Sergeant Raymond Fernandez of the Tampa DUI Squad surely understood the need for probable cause. So in 2012, when Sergeant Fernandez got a tip about a potential drunk driver, he knew what he had to do to get a good conviction. Sergeant Fernandez got a call from a friend of his who provided a tip. His friend said, "There's this guy that works in my building. He's an attorney. He gets drunk all the time, and he goes to this restaurant, drinks it up, and then he drives home drunk." The tipster assured Officer Fernandez that if he acted quickly, he'd probably catch him leaving his favorite restaurant in his black BMW any minute. After the tipster gave Sergeant Fernandez the vehicle description, the sergeant sent one of his officers to the scene. He was directed to watch the area, look for that car, and when he found it, watch how it was driving. If the driver seemed drunk, pull him over. The officer went to the scene and he waited. He looked for the black BMW, but there was to be no arrest that day. The officer dispatched by Sergeant Fernandez never did see the car, never saw any erratic driving, and never made an arrest. And that's how it goes sometimes. No vehicle, no driving, no arrest. Sergeant Fernandez came up empty that day, but what he didn't know at the time is that he'd have another opportunity to rendezvous with the driver of that black BMW. He also didn't know something far more sinister. Sergeant Raymond Fernandez was being used as a pawn in a game that would have disastrous consequences for everyone involved. Him, that driver, and even the tipster. So tuck that away from me for a moment, the little story about Sergeant Raymond Fernandez of the Tampa Police Department, and travel with me back to 1976. That's where we're going to find a child named Todd Schnitt. Todd Schnitt wanted to be in radio. Even as a little kid, he knew that radio was his calling. Todd was bit by the bug at 16 years old when his family left New York and moved to Virginia Beach. Schnitt became captivated by the radio shows in southeastern Virginia, but it got even better for young Todd. The strong 50,000-watt signal of WABC radio in New York City, well, it reached all the way down to his home in Virginia. What did that mean? It meant that Todd Schnitt could learn from the best. As a youngster, Todd studied those radio shows, believing in his heart that radio was in his future. Todd's passion for radio, combined with his naturally inquisitive nature, well, that allowed him to move up the ranks in the radio world. One of Schnitt's early big breaks was in the mid-90s when he nabbed the job as a host of a morning drive show in Tampa, Florida. He created a radio persona called MJ the DJ, and he got together with a partner who called himself BJ. That's a lot of J's, right? Well, their show, MJ and BJ in the Morning, it aired on WFLZ. Being in Tampa was the perfect place for a mover and shaker in the radio world in the mid-90s. Q105 Tampa is where legendary morning DJ Scott Shannon invented the morning zoo format. Schnitt, or MJ as he was called on air, would actually work for Scott Shannon at Pirate Radio KQLZ in Los Angeles and again in WPLJ in New York City. Am I the only one who's old enough to remember when WPLJ was actually rock and roll, classic rock? Yeah, I'm dating myself there, aren't I? Well, Todd Schnitt's home base would be in Tampa, Florida, where he would grow to be somewhat of an institution. Bouncing around between both music and talk radio formats, Schnitt would eventually have his shows syndicated all over San Francisco, Salt Lake City, Raleigh, Durham, Tampa, and Miami. Meanwhile, a different Todd would chart his own path in the radio world several thousand miles away in the Midwest. Todd Clem was born in Warsaw, Indiana. In 1986, Todd was working as a bouncer and driver for a nightclub while in college, and he gave the radio DJ Scary Kerry Gray a ride to the club. Todd was a fan, and it seemed that the two men struck up a conversation. That conversation led to a goof. On April Fool's Day in 1986, Gray gave Clem an on-air shift as a joke. Todd Clem appeared on WPFR-FM in Terre Haute, Indiana as Rockin' Bubba Clem. Well, that joke turned into something far more serious. Todd Clem's life as a radio personality was off and running. Clem became Gray's intern and then got the gig hosting a weekend show, followed by a part-time midday shift. He eventually became the station's general manager. When attending a fraternity party with Clem, Gray was impressed with all the attention Clem was getting from the ladies. Gray called his protege a love sponge, and the name stuck. The radio personality Bubba the Love Sponge was born. Bubba bounced between radio jobs in Texas, Chicago, and Philadelphia, eventually landing down south in Tampa, Florida. In December of 1996, Bubba the Love Sponge started a morning show in WXTB in Tampa. By the early 2000s, Bubba the Love Sponge was making more than $2 million a year. His FM show was syndicated throughout the country, and his uncensored show was killing it on Sirius satellite radio. Bubba was on top of the radio world, with offshoot businesses in restaurants, pager sales, limos, and merch. Shock jocks take risks. I mean, they're called shock jocks for a reason. One of the reasons they garner huge followings is because they frequently push the envelope of good taste. Well, like a lot of shock jocks, Bubba eventually lost his job after some risque interviews. Bubba was forced to leave town for a while, but you know how things work in that industry, right? Clem had to lay low for a while and allow a little time to elapse. Well, after the appropriate time in exile, Todd Clem's Bubba the Love Sponge returned to Florida to give it another go. In 2008, the two Todds were brought together in Tampa. But it wouldn't be a kinship, it would be a clash. Todd Schnitt at his MJ in the Morning show was #1 in 2008. Todd Clem and his Bubba persona came back to the city as basically a startup show. That meant that he was in dead last in the ratings. If Bubba was going to try to dethrone his competition, he needed to make a splash. As he explained it, what do radio guys do? They go after the #1 radio guy, kind of like pro wrestling. He needed to do a little bit of smack talking about the competition. Bubba said, "You take a shot at the king, and at that time, MJ was the king. You'd think that in a ratings war against his competing DJ, Bubba would start to talk crap about the DJ Todd Schnitt. I mean, he was the king and Bubba was going after the king. But Bubba took a different approach. He went after the king and the queen. Todd Schnitt's wife is named Michelle, and she was an attorney and former prosecutor in Florida's Hillsborough County and a former assistant state's attorney who worked in Palm Beach County. Apparently, Bubba thought she was fair game in the ratings war between the DJs, and he set his crosshairs on the lawyer as well as her DJ husband. Bubba took to the airwaves and called Michelle a whore. He described MJ as a midget, and he wished his competitor dead. One time he broadcast, quote, "I will not be happy until I have an MJ funeral in the streets of Tampa." All of that was apparently too much for Todd Schnitt to bear, and he decided it was time to sue Bubba the Love Sponge. Schnitt claimed that he and his wife had been personally and professionally damaged by Clem's on-air comments. The pair hired Phil Campbell of the firm Schumacher, Loop & Kendrick. The Schnitts sued Bubba for defamation in 2008. Now, Bubba's defense to the case was pretty simple. He claimed that Schnitt and his wife were public figures, and therefore they're fair game. Bubba hired attorneys Adam Filthout, Robert Adams, and Stephen Diaco from the Adams and Diaco firm to mount his defense. Have you ever been involved in a lawsuit? Do you remember what that feels like? Lawsuits of all kinds are tough on parties. They just suck all around. I used to tell my clients that if you find yourself in a lawsuit, you've lost already. It doesn't matter what the outcome is, just being involved in a suit is a loss. They're expensive and they are emotionally draining. They consume you. It's all the litigants think about morning, noon, and night while the case is going on. And those cases, they can last forever. Well, the only way you can make a lawsuit worse is to make it a defamation case. Defamation cases are the worst kinds of suits for both the lawyer and the client. They're not like, say, your run-of-the-mill contract disputes. In contract disputes, people are angry about a deal gone bad. But in defamation cases, they're personal. Think about it. The very foundation of those suits are personal attacks, so that makes the case 1,000 times more aggravating. It makes the litigants more angry, which in turn makes the lawyers more angry, which leads to both sides taking pot shots at one another, and eventually it makes the judge angry. They are just the worst. It was no different in the Schnitt-Clem defamation suit. Well, that's not exactly true. In addition to the aggravation that usually comes with one of these suits, there was also the fact that these two litigants were the most famous people in Tampa at the time. The fact that the press could not get enough of this suit ratcheted up the pressure on everyone. As you can expect, the case dragged on, and on, and on. It eventually got to trial 5 years after it was first filed. While opening statements were going on in the courthouse, Bubba the Love Sponge was ranting on the air. He complained about multimillionaires who send their kids to private schools. He claimed the Schnitts were suing him for millions while living in a nearly 10,000 square foot home. The trial was expected to be ugly and long. Dozens of witnesses were going to testify on both sides, including testimony from both the Schnitts and Bubba. This had the chance to be a spectacular event, and it was getting a ton of media attention because the litigants were two of the most popular people in all of Tampa. The expectation of sensationalism was accurate, but no one could have expected the turn that things would take not too long after the start of those opening statements. Roughly 2 weeks after the beginning of the trial on January 23, 2013, Schnitt's lawyer, 64-year-old Phil Campbell, was probably exhausted. Every day of the trial likely took a toll on him, as well as all of the lawyers involved. I mean, trials usually do. To a large extent, the lawyers end up living these trials almost as much as the clients. The lawyers think about it on their time off. They go over the day's events while staring aimlessly at a field during their kid's soccer game. They consider and reconsider strategies while sitting on the couch at home while a movie plays in the background. So it was expected that after what was surely an arduous day of trial work on the Schnitt v. Clem matter, Todd Schnitt's lawyer Phil Campbell would grab dinner and drinks with his trial partner. It just so happened that a Tampa landmark was just around the corner from their office. Malio's Prime Steakhouse would be the perfect place to unwind and maybe debrief about the day's events in court. Campbell walked over to Malio's and met his colleague around 5 p.m. Around that same time, 32-year-old Melissa Personius was also getting ready to go out. Melissa was going to meet her friend Vanessa for drinks. The two women used to work together, so it seems like it was going to be a little reunion of sorts. The pair met at Malio's Prime Steakhouse and ordered a glass of wine. The vibe in Malio's was probably too old for Melissa and Vanessa. Malio's caters to a more sophisticated, older crowd, which might really just be a nice way of saying stuffy. So it wouldn't be so surprising that a couple of young women like Melissa and Vanessa would be interested in finding a place with, a little bit more life. They eventually decided to head over to the Fly Bar, a trendier place whose clientele was a lot closer to their age bracket. As Melissa walked out of Malio's, however, someone caught her eye. Phil Campbell was at the bar having a drink, and Melissa recognized the lawyer. It's not so surprising that Melissa would recognize Phil Campbell. They both worked in the same industry. Melissa was a paralegal in Tampa. And even though Tampa is a relatively large metropolitan area, the legal industry there is tight-knit. Without saying anything to Campbell, Melissa and Vanessa left Malio's and headed over to the Fly Bar. When they got there, the women ordered drinks, but Melissa simply could not stop thinking about Phil Campbell. At one point, Melissa excused herself to go make a phone call, and when she got back to the table, Melissa started to convince her friend to go back to Malio's to talk to the guy she saw at the bar. Vanessa didn't think anything of it. She figured the guy at the bar that caught Melissa's attention was some young guy she was interested in. But why couldn't Melissa Personius get Phil Campbell out of her mind? Sometimes you can't get a person you see out of your head because you can't quite place how you know them. That was not happening in this case. Melissa Personius couldn't get Phil Campbell out of her head because she knew exactly who he was. Melissa Personius wasn't just a paralegal in Tampa. Melissa Personius worked for Adams and Diaco, the firm defending Bubba the Love Sponge in the Schnitt case. And the person she answered to at the firm was one of the primary lawyers working on the case, Robert Adams. And the call she made when she excused herself from the table with Vanessa, that was to her boss, Robert Adams. Melissa told her boss that she saw one of the lawyers who represented Schnitt at Malio's. Did he want her maybe to go back there? Robert Adams probably couldn't believe his luck. His adversary was downing drinks at a bar. If he gave the nod to Melissa, he can have an operative there. Yes, Melissa Personius worked in the Adams and Diaco law firm, but she wasn't working on the Schnitt matter, so Phil Campbell would have no idea who she was. Melissa could walk right up to Campbell, and he'd be clueless. Robert Adams, it seems, was intrigued. He was in the middle of a $1 million knockdown, drag-out lawsuit. The parties were at each other's proverbial throats, each searching for an edge in a messy case that they both really wanted to win. Now, there are several ways to score a win in a trial like this. One is to present outstanding evidence. Another is to utilize superior lawyering skills. A third way is to get your opposing lawyer thrown into jail. With Adams' appetite for victory properly whetted, Robert Adams called his partner, Steve Diaco, to see what he thought. They both clearly realized that Melissa Personius was in a position to help them strike a fatal blow against Todd Schnitt by disqualifying his lawyer, Phil Campbell. That's when the crew ultimately hatched a plan worthy of a John Grisham novel. If Melissa Personius could get back to Malio's before Phil Campbell left, she could convince him to keep on downing drinks. Then he'd head home while driving drunk and get arrested. Once he got arrested, Bubba's lawyers would make a motion to have him removed from the case. With the lead lawyer thrown out of the case, Todd Schnitt's case would surely go into a tailspin. Who knows? He might dismiss it altogether. It just might work. Of course, it sounds good in theory, but how do you pull something like that off practically? The first part of the plan was easy. Using an attractive woman in her 30s to get the attention of a 64-year-old man sitting at a bar, yeah, that was simple. But the second part of the plan was a shot in the dark. There was no guarantee that Campbell would actually get picked up for DUI, except that the lawyers had a connection. As the plan took shape, Adams decided to call his other co-counsel, Adam Filthout, to bring him up to speed. He told him that Campbell was at the steakhouse and he explained the burgeoning plan. But why bring in Filthout? It's because Adam Filthout was indispensable. He had the key connection. He had a family friend who would be a crucial link in pulling all of this off. Adam Filthout was close personal friends with Sergeant Raymond Fernandez of the Tampa Police Department's DUI squad. The plan was in place. Melissa would go back to the bar, chat up Campbell, and get him to drink more. When he was sufficiently drunk, he'd get into his car and drive off. Filthout would then call Sergeant Fernandez to tip him off about the driver. Sergeant Fernandez would be ready and waiting for him, and the officer would then jump into action, arresting the lawyer for DUI. If that scenario sounds familiar, it should. That's because Filthout tried to ensnare his adversary once before. Lawyer Phil Campbell was the driver of the black BMW that was the object of Sergeant Fernandez's earlier stakeout, and Adam Filthout was the person who gave him the tip. The difference between now and then was, this time, the lawyers had an ace in the hole. Adam Filthout told that ace, Melissa Personius, to go back to Malio's and execute their plan. For her part, Melissa was probably eager to go. Witnesses would later testify that she believed that if all went well, her boss was going to give her a big bonus and make her the best paid paralegal in the office. So, Melissa was all in. But first, she needed to convince her friend Vanessa to head back to Malio's. It seems she told her that there was a guy at the bar back in Malio's that Melissa saw on their way out the door, and she wanted to go back to chat him up. Vanessa probably figured that the person her friend was referring to was some young guy that Melissa wanted to hit on. In apparent solidarity with her friend, Vanessa abandoned the glass of Chardonnay she was drinking at the fly bar, and they both scurried on back to Malio's. Meanwhile, Phil Campbell was apparently ready to end his evening. He'd basically finished up, and it was time for him to head out. But just as he was preparing to leave Malio's, two women sat down next to him at the bar. Melissa and Vanessa tried to get the bartender's attention, but they weren't having success. As Campbell raised his hand to call over the bartender, Melissa Personius saw her opening. She said, "I see you've got some pull here." Now, Vanessa was probably surprised. This wasn't the type of person she expected to lure Melissa back to Malio's. And yet, here was her friend chatting up this 60-plus-year-old man. Over the next few hours, yes, the next few hours, over the next few hours, Melissa worked her mark. She played with her long, dark hair, and she flirted with Campbell. She even bought drinks for him. Melissa lied to Campbell about where she worked, telling him that she worked for a different Tampa firm called Trenum Kempker. They flirted with one another for hours, downing vodkas the entire time. As Melissa executed her part of the plan, the crew stayed in constant contact. Phone records showed that the group furiously texted and called each other dozens of times. In addition to staying in contact with one another, Filthout made the critical call to his friend on the Tampa Police Department. He called Sergeant Fernandez and told him that there was a guy that worked in his building who was constantly going out to bars and driving home drunk. The guy was at Malio's right now, Filthout explained, and if Fernandez headed that way, he was likely to catch him when he drove home in his black BMW. Fernandez might have been skeptical or at least a little confused. He said, "Is that the guy you called me about before?" Filthout confirmed that it was. He said, "It's an attorney that's in my building. He's out drinking again at night at Malio's. He's gonna drive home again tonight, drunk." Sergeant Fernandez says, "Well, we didn't get him last time. We'll sit on him again and see what he does." Sergeant Fernandez might not have gotten involved if he knew the whole story. You see, Adam Filthout didn't tell Sergeant Fernandez that he was sending his longtime friend into a hornet's nest. He never told the officer that the person Filthout was targeting was the opposing attorney in the much-publicized Schnitt versus Clem trial. Fernandez seems to have thought that he was simply being given a tip about a potential drunk driver. He had no idea he was being used as a pawn in a nefarious scheme. And it was indeed nefarious. Never before had lawyers conspired like this to take down their opponent. This was movie-level stuff, not something that actual lawyers litigating a case get involved in. And yet, that's exactly what was happening. Fernandez, not realizing all of the circumstances, dispatched a member of his DUI squad to sit outside Malio's and wait. At 8 p.m. that night, after going off duty, Fernandez relieved his officer and took up surveillance along with another 2 officers. As they laid in wait, Fernandez got constant updates from Filthout about what Phil Campbell was doing inside Malio's. By 9:30, Campbell's dinner companion had left. Melissa's friend Vanessa had also gone home. Before she left, she noticed that Melissa seemed drunk and she told her not to drive. "Take a cab," she told her friend. After Vanessa left, the only people still in the bar from that group was Melissa and Phil Campbell chatting away. And it was during that talk that Melissa learned something that could scuttle the entire plan. Phil Campbell had walked to the restaurant. Not only that, he didn't even have a car there, and he planned to walk home, which was only a few blocks away. That was apparently his usual MO. It seems Campbell went to Malio's often, and he always walked home. This was a problem. If Campbell walked home, there would be no way for Sergeant Fernandez to stop him, and the entire plan would go bust. Melissa knew that she needed to get Campbell behind the wheel somehow, so she tried a different angle. As the pair left the restaurant, Melissa told Campbell that her car was in valet parking. Campbell switched into chivalrous mode. He told her he'd see if it could be kept overnight in the garage. After all, he shouldn't be driving, and she should be taking a cab home. Campbell checked with the valet attendant, and he confirmed the car could be left overnight. But Melissa was insistent. She needed to get to her car, she explained. Campbell reluctantly had the valet bring up her car. When it arrived, Melissa refused to leave her car. If she wasn't going to drive it home, she claimed, she at least needed to move it out of this garage. She insisted that the car needed to be moved to a public parking lot because then she'd be able to have access to it. She needed it to drive her kids in the morning, she said. Campbell wanted her to take a cab. Melissa, however, was indignant. Out of frustration, Phil Campbell agreed to move the car to a lot near his apartment building and to call her a cab from there. He had no idea he was walking straight into the trap. At 9:28, Melissa texted lawyer Steve Diaco. Steve Diaco then immediately called Filthout. Filthout then sent a text to Sergeant Fernandez, and a minute later, Sergeant Fernandez messaged one of his officers on the stakeout. The message read, "Leaving the bar now." The messages were being exchanged in such a flurry that Fernandez's last message was received almost before Campbell had actually set foot outside the bar. But there was a problem. The cops expected Campbell to be driving his black BMW. The crew texted each other frantically over the next few minutes, trying to relay the fact that Campbell would be driving Melissa's car, not his own. Finally, The officer at the scene got the right info. Dark Nissan, valet Malios. Phil Campbell was behind the wheel of the Nissan as he left Malios. He figured he'd be okay driving the few blocks to the garage near his apartment. He had no idea he was being stalked. Almost immediately after Phil Campbell left the restaurant, Sergeant Fernandez pulled behind him in an unmarked car and stopped him. Fernandez claimed that Campbell made an illegal turn, but there was no one else present to witness Campbell's driving, and Phil Campbell was arrested for DUI. While Phil Campbell was in the police station being processed for DUI, Melissa Personius went home. She returned to the house she shared with her ex-husband and excitedly admitted everything that took place that evening. To say that the evening was a tough one for Phil Campbell would be an understatement. Not only was he arrested, but he also had a job to do. There was a full day of trial the next day in the Schnitt-Clem matter. And despite his personal issues, he had a professional obligation to his client. So at some point that night, he started to prepare for the next day's events. He had to. And that's when he realized a huge problem. He couldn't find his briefcase. That bag had everything he needed for trial, all of his notes, all of the details of the witnesses. All of it was in his briefcase. Without it, he couldn't go forward with the trial. He must have turned his apartment upside down looking for the thing. I could imagine his face when it dawned on him. I left the bag in the back seat of Melissa Personius' car. When Phil Campbell and the rest of the Schnitt team showed up in court that next morning, they told the court what happened. They informed the court what was going on, and they explained that they couldn't move forward because they needed Phil Campbell's bag. All of his notes, all of his witness preparation, everything that he needed for that morning's testimony was in there. The Schnitt team got lucky. Unbeknownst to all of the lawyers, the judge had already planned to only go half a day in court that day, so it wouldn't be a big deal for him just to let the jury go and adjourn for tomorrow. So the Schnitt team, the court, and Bubba's lawyers all agreed to recess for the day as a professional courtesy to Mr. Campbell. Phil Campbell went back to look for his briefcase. Campbell was probably pretty confident that he'd find the bag. It was after 9 a.m., which means that people were all coming back to work, and all he had to do was contact the firm Melissa said she worked for and tell him that he needs to get in touch with one of their paralegals. While Phil Campbell was hunting for his bag, Steve Diaco was speaking to the press. Diaco stood outside the courthouse and gave interviews to the media about the case. And oh, he laid it on thick. He was shocked that the matter was adjourned for the day. He said he felt horrible for the jurors. He cried about how Phil Campbell's behavior made a mockery of the legal system. He said, quote, "The whole thing makes me embarrassed to be an attorney. I don't understand why his other partners who have been there every single day of the trial, I don't understand why they can't continue this case." Diaco was ruthless. About Campbell, he said, quote, "I hope he gets help. My partner was working on this trial last night. Phil didn't seem to be doing the same. And now we're being penalized." He claimed that this was Phil Campbell's second DUI and that his last DUI was almost twice the legal limit. He didn't learn his lesson. Why did Diaco go to the press and make such a fuss? Why did Steve Diaco try to essentially publicly humiliate Phil Campbell? It was basically the final part of the plan. What Melissa Personius started in the bar would be finished by Diaco in front of the press. According to Florida authorities, Steve Diaco was trying to influence jurors. Diaco surely knew that his statements would get a ton of media attention. The case was being followed diligently because of Schnitt and Clem's celebrity status. There was a chance, therefore, that someone in the jury would hear about what happened, and that would affect the credibility of the other lawyer. If the other lawyer isn't seen as credible, then the jury might also feel that way about their client. They may feel that Todd Schnitt is also not credible. While Steve Diaco was hamming it up in front of the press, Melissa Personius was struggling at home. Her bosses told her not to come to work that day, and that was probably an ominous sign. And it didn't take long for her excitement from the night before to dissipate because things started to turn ugly. The arrest was in the news. And once Melissa saw the news report, she must have immediately thought of her friend Vanessa. The press would surely contact Vanessa, so Melissa called her and tried to prep her for any questions about the evening's events. But when Vanessa saw what was being said in the news, she cut off her old workmate. Around noon, Melissa's stomach probably dropped through the floor. That's when she found Phil Campbell's briefcase in the back seat of her car. She called her bosses to tell them what she'd found. The right thing to do would be for the lawyers to contact Phil Campbell and tell him to pick it up. But they couldn't do that. If anyone from the Diaco firm returned the bag, then Phil Campbell would figure out that Melissa Personius was actually their paralegal, and that would connect them to the event, and it would all certainly seem like a setup. The firm sent an associate to Melissa's house to pick up the bag. The associate brought it back to the firm offices, where they kept the bag almost the entire workday. They never told anybody they had it. In fact, in what appears to be a diversionary tactic, Steve Diaco called Phil Campbell's firm and asked them if they wanted to arrange a meeting to discuss settlement of the case. He didn't mention anything about the bag. He was clearly trying to throw them off the scent. That call might have bought the firm some time, but they had to figure out how to distance themselves from the previous evening's events. That bag, the link between them and the setup, was a problem. It seems that they finally came up with yet another plan. They could return the bag anonymously. Someone from the firm drove the bag back to Melissa Personius' house, and they told her to drive it to the Bank of America building where Phil Campbell's law office was located, and they told her to deliver it to a security guard in the lobby. The security guard would surely tell Campbell that someone delivered his bag, he'd get it back, and the firm would be in the clear. That might have worked if Phil Campbell hadn't figured things out. And come on, it was obvious that he was going to figure things out, right? Phil Campbell remembered who Melissa said she worked for. So that day, Campbell reached out to that firm, Trenham Kemker, and asked if he could get in touch with their paralegal, Melissa Personius. Their response? Melissa who? Yeah, it didn't take Phil Campbell too much longer to figure out who Melissa Personius actually worked for. And when he did, he must have been fuming. The pain that he felt from the prior evening's events was probably amplified by the prospect that the entire ordeal might have been orchestrated by his adversary. Campbell had his law partner call Steve Diaco and demand that the bag be returned. Later that day, Melissa Personius took a taxi to the building where Campbell's law office was located and had the cab driver return the bag to the security desk in the lobby. So much for anonymity. Now, Diaco's antics in front of the press probably made sense to the Schnitt legal team. They surely knew there was a high probability that someone in the jury would hear about Campbell's arrest now. If they did, the jury would be tainted, and that could really hurt their client's case. The lawyers couldn't chance it. So what they did was make a motion for a mistrial. If they could get the judge to declare a mistrial, the case would be dismissed, but they'd be able to refile the case and eventually move on with a different jury. That's what Phil Campbell did. He immediately filed a motion for mistrial on behalf of his client, Todd Schnitt. The allegations in that motion were clear and biting. They explained that Bubba's lawyers held on to Campbell's briefcase and made inflammatory statements to the media. The motion seems to have had a second objective. Campbell now surely knew that the entire ordeal was a big setup, and he probably figured that he could use the motion for a mistrial to prove it. So, in the motion papers, they demanded that Steve Diaco produce his cell phone for inspection. Diaco didn't have much time to figure out how he'd deal with all of this. The court scheduled a hearing on the motion for the very next day. Diaco must have been significantly spooked because he hired a lawyer for himself. Oof. The next day at the hearing, Diaco's lawyer tried to get the court to throw out Campbell's request for his phone. Oh, and Steve Diaco didn't show up to the hearing. The judge was not happy. He adjourned the hearing but told Diaco's lawyer that he wanted Steve Diaco in court that afternoon to face the music. And when the court reconvened that day, Diaco showed. But he didn't have a cell phone. The judge was surely furious, and he started to ask tough questions of Steve Diaco. At that moment, Diaco must have felt like Luke Skywalker, Han Solo, and Princess Leia when they were in the trash compactor. The walls were pushing in slowly, and there seemed to be no way out. Diaco's only option was to clam up. The judge asked him, "Did you have any discussions with Melissa Personius or Adam Filthout on the night of Phil Campbell's arrest 2 days ago?" Diaco replied, "I don't remember." It was 2 days ago. How do you not remember? The judge asked, "Who's your cell phone carrier?" Diaco replied, "I don't know." He didn't know his cell phone carrier. At that point, the judge surely believed that Diaco was lying. And it's almost a given that the judge wanted to get to the bottom of what happened. The problem was the judge had another competing priority. The Todd Schnitt-Todd Clem case had been going on for half a decade. They were in the middle of a trial. So despite the obvious shenanigans that were taking place, and despite the need to sort all that out, the judge prioritized the Schnitt-Clem trial. The motion for a mistrial was denied. The trial went on. And the Schnitts lost. That's right. When the Schnitt-Clem trial finished up, Bubba the Love Sponge soaked up a win. The jury just didn't buy the argument that Clem made defamatory statements about Schnitt or his wife. But the loss of the trial wasn't the biggest disappointment for Phil Campbell. He certainly intended to pursue ethics charges against his adversaries. I mean, they set him up, and he couldn't let them get away with it. But that was going to be tough, because during the time the trial was going on, all of the conspirators destroyed the evidence from the setup. The judge told him to keep it, but it seems they didn't listen. Some cell phones were destroyed, others were erased. Sergeant Fernandez said that his text messages were wiped out when he put some new software on his phone. All the cell phone records and other message transcripts from the lawyers, all of the ones from their lawyers, all the ones from their employees, all the ones from Sergeant Fernandez, they were all gone. None of that, however, stopped the ethics authority from pursuing the lawyers. This was simply too egregious a situation to let go. So on June 2nd, 2014, the Florida bar filed disciplinary complaints against Diaco, Adams, and Filthout. The offending lawyers were now forced to hire lawyers of their own to defend themselves. First, they tried to get the cases dismissed, but those motions were denied. The next move was to put up a wall of silence. The disciplinary authorities tried to put the lawyers on the spot by deposing them. They asked Filthout if he destroyed his cell phone or erased messages. He refused to answer. Diaco also refused to testify, claiming his right against self-incrimination. The FBI contacted Melissa Personius' ex-husband to interview him about what she said after coming home on the night of the setup, and Melissa told him to keep his mouth shut. The crew kept up that approach even at the eventual ethics trial. When called to testify at trial, Filthout and Diaco refused to do so. Melissa Personius, too. She refused to answer every question that she was asked after giving her name, claiming her right to remain silent under the Fifth Amendment. The only person to testify was Robert Adams. His lawyer claimed that he had a momentary lapse of judgment and that his mistakes were spontaneous and unplanned. The authorities didn't buy it. Turns out, however, that the lawyers didn't even need to speak in order to get popped. That's because Raymond Fernandez was singing. He provided a wealth of information, and all of that was used against the lawyers. Plus, the Tampa Police Department recorded and preserved communications between patrol vehicles from that night. And it also didn't help that the three lawyers put up ridiculous defenses. It wasn't a setup, they claimed. They were motivated by trying to stop a drunk driver. In the end, the ethics authorities didn't believe any of the lawyers' thin justifications. The conspiracy was obvious, and the resulting judgment against the lawyers was damning. The ethics authorities found that a conspiracy did exist. They stated, quote, "The active participation of all of the lawyers in the effort to effect the arrest of Mr. Campbell is beyond dispute." The court would eventually confirm that the entire fiasco was a deliberate and malicious effort to place a heavy finger on the scale of justice for the sole benefit of the lawyers and their client. For the lawyers, the harm inflicted on Mr. Campbell, his client's cause, Sergeant Fernandez, the legal system, the profession, and the public's confidence in justice was simply collateral damage. All three lawyers who orchestrated the plot, Adams, Filthout, and Diaco, have all been permanently disbarred from the practice of law. Meanwhile, the Tampa Police Department held an administrative personnel hearing about Sergeant Raymond Fernandez. He was fired from the police force. Oh, and the Schnitz didn't fare too well either. In the end, they ended up owing Phil Campbell's firm over $1 million in legal fees and ended up in another lawsuit fighting over those fees. The only bright spot, if you can call it that, was on Phil Campbell. After a 6-month investigation, the DUI charge against Campbell was deemed to be entrapment, and the charges were dropped. His arrest was eventually expunged. Thank you very much for listening, everyone. I will speak to you again in 2025. I've got some interesting stuff planned for next year. I think I'm going to do several series. Maybe I'll find some real juicy stories that I spread out over a couple of episodes. We'll see. I think it'll be great. I hope you have a wonderful holiday season and a great new year. Stay safe, and I'll speak with you soon.